Hey YouTube, welcome back. We have 3 builds for you today. They're all Rive builds, and the progression from one build to the next build and the iteration on trying to make the build better and better and better is a story that I want to share with you. So if you're only interested in the build planners, those are always in the description of this video. You can skip forward if you want to, but this is a story about Theorycrafting events that happen on Twitch, and starting out with Jasper's Searing Pride, using Rive, and then turning that build into something super spicy later on. So we started out by using Jasper's Searing Pride. This is a unique two-handed staff, and we have these Theorycrafting events on Discord and on Twitch. And what we do is we vote for one unique item that's kind of not used, not very popular, and we try to make it as good as possible. We try to find spicy things to do with these unique items. So Jasper's Searing Pride has some stuff going for it. It's a unique two-handed staff, which means you can't get attack speed on it, but it's a staff that has a bunch of attack-related things on it. It has some melee physical damage, it has good base, it has +1 melee skills. It also happens to have some adaptive damage as the implicit, because it's a staff, so that's interesting. It's got some block chance, some block effect. Maybe you can try to build into a block character. It has some plus levels to Flame Reave, Surge, and Enchant Weapon in case you wanted to build around it that way. I wasn't too fond of those, so that's not the direction that I took it. But I tried to use Jasper's for the last 2 lines of text on it. It says, when you use a melee attack and hit at least one enemy, you gain a stack of a buff. Each stack of that buff gives you +2 melee fire damage and 20% melee ignite chance. So the fire damage is kind of interesting. You could play this with crit and, just attack as much as possible. You have about 100 melee physical damage as the implicit, and then you have exalted melee physical damage as the explicit. It rolls from 55 to 75. It's basically tier 6 melee physical damage. So you have a bunch of melee physical damage, and every time you hit, you gain this stacking buff that expires after 8 seconds, and it gives you +2 melee fire damage. So what I wanted to do with this was maybe go ignite, and every time that you attack, you'd build up a bunch of attack speed, and you'd stack up this melee ignite chance. So I was brainstorming ideas about this, but what I ended up doing during this Theorycrafting event is I tried to use Rive and use the node called Execution, which says your third strike consumes all stacks of ignite on the enemies it hits, granting you % increased physical damage. So I used Rive, I used Jasper's Searing Pride to stack up all that melee ignite chance, and then instead of ignoring it or building around it, I consumed all of those stacks of ignite, turned it into melee, or I guess it turned it into % physical damage, and then that fueled the rest of my crit Rive build. So for a crit Rive build, you could be 3rd hit crit, you could be all of your hits crit. You can't go 2nd hit only, because it's the 3rd hit that actually consumes all those stacks of ignite and causes you to gain that % increased physical damage. So at first, while my gear was bad, I did this crit Rive thing, and I had my 3rd hit crit because I didn't have enough crit on my gear. But then we were a Paladin, and we tried to make use of the adaptive spell damage implicit on Jasper's Searing Pride, and that, with attacking very fast to stack up the stacks from Jasper's, allowed us to use Holy Aura's Flame Burst, and then it would explode, it would deal a bunch of AoE damage, it would pop off, and kill a bunch of enemies. So one thing that we quickly found out about this is that Rive has a 2nd hit pull. So for every 2nd hit from Rive would pull enemies who are too far away, and it would kind of bunch up all those enemies. And then the 3rd hit would be like the crit damage. It would consume all the stacks of ignite, and then because all the enemies are right on top of each other, it would also shotgun with the Flame Burst. So by stacking up the adaptive damage from this, a little bit of spell damage, you'd have your sigils spec'd for some extra % increased damage as well, and that would fuel Holy Aura's Flame Burst, dealing as much damage as possible. So it was hard to get a good amount of crit on this, because you're not using an offhand catalyst. You could use a Prismatic Gaze like we were trying to do here, but it's really hard to get crit onto Holy Aura because it doesn't have any crit nodes by itself, you're not using a catalyst, and Prismatic Gaze is only going to take you so far. So that was the idea for this build. There's nothing too spicy going on. At its core, this is a melee physical crit build. that happens to be proccing Holy Aura's Flame Burst as well. So the planner for this will be linked below. It's a pretty straightforward skill tree, nothing too spicy going on. We do have the fire and physical shred. So physical shred because we're a melee physical build, and fire shred because we're dealing fire damage with flame burst. So this is a nice little thing to include here. And then of course the throwing skill is procced off of our base mastery, this axe thrower stuff. So you'll see builds use this from time to time. It's pretty cool. So that's where this build started out. And while we were playing this, I was thinking, how can we use Jasper's Searing Pride and have our melee physical damage and the melee physical damage and the melee fire damage and the ignite? How can we make all these things work in the same direction? So I was thinking, like, we're using Rive here. Like, we had this spell that's proccing off of Holy Aura, but there's also a spell in Rive. This Indomitable node, it's not a melee tag, but it's a spell physical tag. So I was thinking, okay, so what if we use this node? Or like, what if we didn't consume ignites? I was thinking about all these different permutations of how to make this character work. And we ended up thinking, you know, if we have melee physical damage and melee ignite damage, and we have a spell physical tag here, and then we have a spell fire tag over here from Flame Burst, and then we also have a throwing attack, and we have divine bolts, which proc pretty consistently as well. We have all these different things happening. How can we make them all point in the same direction so that we're using the same shred, so that we're scaling the same things across the board? And that led us to build number 2, which is Bleed. So for build number 2, we have a lot of the same stuff going on. We're still a Rive build, but we're outside of the, theory crafting week. We're no longer gated by using Jaspers. So we're going to build this character as well as we can to accomplish this goal. So I set out to create a character that was a Bleed Rive character. And I know that there are Bleed Rive characters on YouTube right now because I know Dread put one out there. So Dread, or Epoch Builds, or hello, this is Dread from Epic Builds. If you know him by that voice line, he has a lot of build guides out there on YouTube. And he tried making a Bleed Rive character. And he likes to do it two-handed as a Forge Guard, stacking attack speed, applying a bunch of ignites, and even using Abyssal Echoes to apply more ignites, and then consume them with the third hit, and then use all of that increased physical damage to apply a bunch of bleeds. So that's his take on how to make this build, or how to make Bleed Rive into a thing. I think it's awesome that we can take the words Bleed Rive and arrive at something that is so entirely different than what Dread put together. So here is build number 2 for this YouTube video here, Bleed Rive. We are a second hit build. Second hit means that we attack wicked fast, because remember the third hit has lower attack speed and the first 2 hits have very high attack speed. Rive has a ton of base attack speed built into it, and if we use a fast weapon like a 1.05 base on this, we can just attack as fast as possible with a fast one-handed weapon as opposed to a relatively slower two-handed weapon. So we're using Wing Guards, we're using our Dragonbone Axe, and we're going to 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 like this. Now, I said that we wanted this build to be like more holistic in combining all the different damage types that we had. So we are second hit, we have a bunch of attack speed. Every second hit has a 100% more damage multiplier on it. And then we have this little one over here, which is kind of an aside. And then our second hit releases this Shockwave, which is a spell. But all of our bleed chance is global bleed chance. We don't have any melee chance to bleed on hit. We don't have anything that says melee on it. So all of our spells are also bleeding. All of our melee hits, also bleeding. All of our throwing attacks that are procced from our mastery over here. All of our divine bolts over here. Everything that we have in this build, including Flame Burst, including the second hit Indomitable Force Wave thing, everything is bleeding. Everything gets all of our bleed chance from it. So once again, we're making use of my new favorite node in the whole game, this challenge node, which pulls enemies in, which means that you can shotgun them with the explosions from Holy Aura. Because if you have 5 enemies and you pull all 5 of those enemies next to each other, all the flame bursts on all of those enemies are going to proc at the same time. Boom. And they're all going to deal damage to each other as well, because it's a little AoE skill. So I really liked that. And we had a pretty normal looking skill. We had some volatile reversal to make enemies take a ton of % increased damage. Because Rive is a mana generator, we don't need to use Volatile Reversal for any kind of mana stuff. So we have no health restore, no mana restore, all attack speed, all damage taken, and we can pretty much numlock this thing, and we get huge amounts of attack speed out of it. So this character felt very, very good. As a offensive option, you could use a Flayer's Pride, which is about a 50% more damage increase overall for the character. It's a huge amount of damage. And then you could maybe get some, Exalted Block Chance, Legendaried onto your Flayer's Pride, and that'd be a great place to be. But as a substitute, or if you just really want that extra layer of tankiness, you could just use a Bastion of Honor, because you have a lot of damage in this build. So we're not going to do like a full dive on this character, because we're going to do that for build number 3. This character was great, loved it, played it for a long time, and I recorded a YouTube video talking exclusively about this build, and I didn't mention the third build, because the third build's a meme. And by meme, I mean it's spicy as hell, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to put it in a YouTube video. But it's too cool not to tell you about. So here's build number 3. We have our very normal looking Rive. We have our very normal looking Holy Aura with our attack speed and our Flame Burst over here. We have our Lunge. Lunge is even a DPS skill. You can use it to get a little buff. And we get our extra physical penetration, 20% physical penetration while we have that buff up. Because we have 2 stacks of Lunge. We use both of them. Volatile. You'll notice that the only skill we didn't hover over was the super boring skill that you always spec the same way. So you probably know how to sigil, or how to set up a sigil for a character like this. So we're not doing that. We are using sigils in a very different way. So I don't know what you want to call this build. You could call this Bleed Spell Rive. You could call this Second Hit Spell Proc Bleed Rive. I don't know what you want to call it. I think Bleed Spell Rive is a pretty good name for it. So we have Divine Bolts from our Mastery. We have the Force Wave from Rive, which is a spell. We have Flame Burst, which is a spell that's going to apply Bleed's Force as well. And we even have a numlocked Sigil of Hope, which detonates and deals way more damage than you think it does. So let's talk about Sigils of Hope for a hot minute. Sigils of Hope, this build has a real opportunity cost to it, right? Because sigils normally give you a bunch of flat armor, they give you % increased damage, they give you some extra block chance, even block effect, which is useful whether you're using a Bastion or a Flayer's Pride, and you get a lot of good generic utility out of Sigils of Hope. Up front, I will tell you that my armor value is about 10% lower, or like my armor damage mitigation here is about 10% lower on this version of the build than it would be on the normal version of this build that uses sigils in the normal way. So you might be asking, Perry, why are we giving up 10% of our armor value here in order to make sigil into a damage buff? It's because it adds about 50% of our overall damage. With our with a Bastion, and my character is spec'd all over the place. With a Bastion, if we have our sigils set up like normal, we hit about 500k bleed DPS, which is an excellent amount of DPS, by the way. It's very impressive. It's excellent, all-rounder, sweet build. If you put on a Flayer's Pride for the normal version with the normal sigils and everything, you hit about 1 million DPS, which is awesome. That is huge DPS. It ramps up over time because of the bleed duration stuff, so it's technically like inflated. But against something like tier 4 Julra, these big healthy bosses, it feels really, really good. So about 550k and like 1 million DPS, right? When you start using sigils, like our little sigil bomb over here, our Bastion of Honor DPS is about 1 million. So it goes from 550k to about 1 million. And our Flayer's Pride DPS goes from about 1 million to about 1.6, 1.55 million. It is a substantial increase in DPS, and it feels incredible when you're fighting bosses. You probably don't need this much damage on like normal monsters or anything, but the meme value of this and the damage output, and like we're giving up some armor, I guess, but it feels so unique and so cool, and it changes how you build the rest of the character, that I couldn't help myself but re-record this video so I can tell you about it. So here's the issue with Sigils of Hope using them as a DPS skill. First of all, you give up defense, but we're in softcore. So when you're using Sigils of Hope, the first sigil that you cast doesn't do anything. The second sigil that you cast detonates. The third sigil that you cast does nothing, and the fourth one detonates. So you'll notice that the second sigil there was an absolute enormous amount of mana. So our sigils cost 45 mana because we're making them instant because we want to keep attacking with Rive the entire time. We spec all the way over here. And then, let's see. So we have our Divine Flayer here. We have a 300% more damage multiplier, which is great. And then we have this node. So Waves of Light says it chains to additional enemies, but every chain costs additional mana. So the more points you spec into this node, the more punishing this node is. This is not easy to maintain in terms of mana, but our build can, which is why it's so awesome. So every point that you put in here makes it chain additional time, and then it also ramps up that mana cost, right? So with all 5 points, it chains 5 additional times, and then it costs 20 mana per chain. So when we have our 211 mana here, you'll see that it drops down a significant amount. So if we numlock this, it doesn't chain additional times if we don't have mana for this. So we get to take advantage of the fact that Rive is a mana generator, and we actually need to have this exalted modifier here. This mana gained when you use Rive and hit at least one enemy. Normally, my helmet for this build would look something like this. It'd be bleed, like bleed effect and chance to bleed while wielding an axe. This kind of helmet would be great if you were playing the normal sigil version of this build. But because we're using sigils as a sigil bomb thing, which costs like 100 mana per cast, we need to have absurd amounts of mana sustain here. So that's why we need this modifier on our helmet like this. So when this happens, it says it chains to additional enemies. It is unclear whether this is a bug or not. Can't tell, but it does definitely chain to the same enemy. So while you're clearing monsters, if you're numlocking your 100 mana cost sigils while you're clearing monsters, first of all, you're a lunatic and I support you. But second of all, you're going to have chains go out to a bunch of monsters around you. On single target, if you're fighting tier 4 Jura, for example, or if you're fighting this dummy here, you'll see that it consumes all of your mana, and all 6 of those hits will hit the same enemy, which is a absolutely absurd amount of damage. Again, it's about 50% more DPS for both versions of our build. That about does it for the spice, and I wanted to hold off on making this build until on making this video until I had a good weapon, because my weapon's kind of boring. It doesn't have any exalted stats on it. And my chest piece is laughable. It has health on it, but it has tier 2 bleed effect and tier 1 bleed duration. And I actually don't want any bleed duration on my chest piece, because all of my bleed duration is coming from my idols. I would like to have tier 5 bleed effect and tier 5 chance to bleed while wielding an axe. I'm missing a lot of damage on this build, and we're already at like 1.6 mil if I'm just attacking this dummy like this. So the build feels fantastic. The first version of the build with Jasper's was pretty interesting. It made us want to play a bleed version of this build, which is a good, super solid version of this build. And it made us want to experiment with the third version of this build using the sigil bomber thing. So it makes me so happy. All right, let's walk through the boring part of the build guide, where I like show you the masteries and whatnot, and then we'll do like a little wrap up at the end. So for the masteries, in case you've never seen something like this, we're using a shield, so we're gonna spec all those 1-pointers just for a little bit of extra block chance. We want the damage reduction from nearby enemies, and then some cooldown recovery speed while we are running around. Note that this does not apply to Volatile Reversal, even though Volatile Reversal is a movement skill, but that doesn't matter because Volatile Reversal is basically never on cooldown because it feels so good. We do want all 5 points in this for all versions of the build because we want to be regenerating the mana as fast as possible. And like early on, when you're like level 10, 20, 30, 40, these nodes feel pretty good as a tiny little bit of sustain too. We want 3, 4, maybe 5 points in axe thrower. I found that 4 points felt pretty good because we're attacking so fast that we're going to be proccing those axes all the time. In an interest of being as tanky as possible, this axe thrower node, along with the shred from the forge guard tree, this is my only source of shred in the build. If you wanted more damage, you could sacrifice a blessing and get fizz shred here. But for me, I have so much damage, I didn't feel like that was necessary, so I chose armor instead. And I think for you, I would recommend the same thing. Your damage will be the same. It's just that my damage takes 4 seconds to ramp up because of my shred being based on this node, which is a 1 second cooldown proc, as opposed to normal shred on hit, which just applies from everything very quickly. So same damage, but this one takes a little bit longer to ramp up, but I get more armor out of it. We're using an axe. We want to attack as fast as possible. Got this node here. Forge guard, we're only in it for this node here. For Void Knight, we spec a couple points into this for resistances, and we do need Volatile Reversal, because Volatile Reversal is busted. Okay, Paladin Mastery here. The important parts about this are all the damage that we get from the physical and physical penetration from this Conviction node. We have a couple points in life and whatnot. The 1 point in Divine Bolt feels awesome. It's another proc, it applies bleeds, it's great for us. We have some points over here for health gain on block and +5 block chance. And then a couple points into crit avoidance and maybe 1 point into this in case you want some haste whenever you go below your endurance threshold. Realistically, the important parts about this are the fizz penetration, the divine bolt, the percent life, percent damage at the very top here, and then these bleed nodes down here. So we don't want melee bleed chance. We want as much generic bleed chance as possible. So just 3 points in dependence and then as many points into the bleed effectiveness as possible. This is exactly what we want here. For our skills, kind of walked through this already, but the important parts about this are turning off the third hit. So we only want the 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2 because it attacks wicked fast. We want the little spell proc here, so 1 point there. We're a bleed build, so armor shred does nothing for us, so we're only putting 1 point in here for travel. We have 4 points into generic more multiplier. Remember, generic more multipliers do apply to bleed. And then my new favorite node in the whole game, this. So this feels great for us. We've got some generic percent more damage over here. And if we had like more points in Rive, there really wouldn't be anything to do with it. So going above level 20 for this build is not particularly useful. You could get more points in slow. I guess. Skip it. For lunge, we have points all the way on the left, which technically makes this like a buff utility skill for us. So on single target, we can buff once, buff twice, and all of a sudden I have a bonus 20% physical penetration. And remember, physical penetration does apply to bleeds. So that's why we have these nodes over here. Otherwise, we just have invulnerability while lunging, and then a second charge of lunge, which is just quality of life, so we can run around faster. In Holy Aura, we have as much attack speed as we can get, some extra resistances to make my gearing laughably easy, and then all of our points over here into Flame Burst, and then more damage for Flame Burst. Again, it's a generic more multiplier, so it does apply to bleeds. For Volatile Reversal, remember Volatile Reversal shotguns? So if you hit an enemy with the first and the second purple circles there, like if you're just standing on top of an enemy, for example, those circles both apply 60% increased damage taken, which is 120% increased damage taken. With it, if you play Path of Exile, for example, you know that that's kind of like a more multiplier. We have our attack speed up here. We have no health recovered, no mana recovered, because we have as much attack speed as possible, and all of our attacks are restoring mana from hitting. So there's that. Let's talk about the gear real quick. This is a bleed character, so it's pretty generic looking stuff, except for the helmet. The helmet for this version of the build needs to have the mana gain when you use Rive and hit an enemy. If you don't want to do the sigil bomb stuff, your helmet would look like this instead. Just bleed effect, chance to bleed if wielding an axe. And ideally, it would be a Solarum helmet to get that crit avoid. If you don't need the crit avoid, you can get more melee attack speed off using a winged helmet. So there's a couple helmet bases which are useful to you. Realistically, just use the best one that you got. For a chest piece, you want tier 5 bleed effect and tier 5 chance to bleed if wielding an axe. And that is as much health as you can possibly get. Same thing for the axe here. We want as much melee attack speed. Physical damage. Physical damage is technically better than damage over time. because physical damage applies to your hit damage as well. But dot or physical damage, that's kind of prefix that you're looking for, but you need that melee attack speed. And then your suffixes are bleed, and then your other suffix could be stun, it could be frailty on melee hit, it could be chill. Any of those things are pretty good. We want wing guards, we want attack as fast as possible. We want a Validator's Chalice for an insane amount of sustain. If you get some LP on this, it's physical damage, damage over time, things like that would be nice. For our amulet, we want to be using a Bleeding Heart. So we only get 2% leech off of this, but because Bleeding Heart is relatively easy to get with LP, I think it's totally worth using here. It's got a good base, it has melee attack speed on it, it's easy to get with LP, and then physical damage, damage over time, frailty is a pretty good suffix if you can get that in there, health, resistance, those kinds of things are what you are looking for. For the rings, I use these to cover my necrotic resistance. I guess we got a little bit of necrotic resistance, but beside the point. Physical damage, damage over time, and then whatever you're looking for there. It'd be nice to get % endurance here instead of in other places, because rings are just a good place to get endurance from. The idols are pretty interesting. So we have a tiny bit of bleed duration coming in from Validator's Chalice, but one of the reasons that our damage looks so good on single target and feels so good on single target is that we have this bleed duration stuff. So we don't need bleed duration in our gear because we're getting so much of it from our idols. We have bleed duration fizz dot, bleed duration fizz dot, ba-da-da-da-da, on all 4 of those. And then the rest of your idols could be health, % health. They could be resistance if you need some help filling in your resistances. Or you could use the 2x2 unique idol for Throne of Ambition, which just gives you a bunch of % increased armor when you're fighting a single target boss. So those are your options for your 2x2 down here and your 2x2 up here. The last bit is blessings. There's a little bit of stuff to talk about. We have our Void Res coming in from Black Sun. We don't need anything else here. You could go flat life, but Void Res is fine. Ending the Storm is just more resistances. This is an interesting blessing here for Reign of Dragons. Normally when you see a build like this, Reign of Dragons would be all resistance or crit avoid. That's like 95% of builds. Crit avoid or all resistances, right? Those are both very good things to get from your blessing from Reign of Dragons. We're a bleed build, and we want as much generic bleed chance as possible. We don't want bleed on melee hit. We don't want bleed on spell hit. We don't want bleed on throwing hit. We want that generic bleed chance. So getting the bleed chance here, I think, is like very, very important for us. Especially because we're playing a Paladin, and we can cover our resistances in other ways. We could use our crit avoid chest piece, and we can use crit avoid from the Paladin mastery tree. So we can cover those in other ways. The opportunity cost is not particularly large, and we want as much of that generic bleed as possible. So let's go ahead and get this. From Spirits of Fire, you could get flat armor, you can get endurance here, but the more that I play hardcore and the more that I play this game, the more that I really appreciate getting flat armor, or maybe armor while channeling from this blessing, and then % armor from this blessing. So again, if you get shred from this blessing, your damage will ramp up faster than mine, because the only shred that I have is coming in from this node, which has a 1-second cooldown because of the axe throw node here. But your peak damage is going to be the same as my peak damage. So I think that's okay. I think I don't really worry about that. But you can see the axe proccing every 1 second there. And then I think that about does it for the blessings. Talked about blessings, gear, mastery, skills, and our idols there. And I think that about does it for this build. That was 3 builds. Like the impetus, the very beginning, using Jasper's Searing Pride. The second build, which is an incredibly like super solid bleed second hit spell rive thing. And then we have this third build, which is so sweet that I couldn't possibly hide it from you, which is like the Sigil Bomber that consumes a gargantuan amount of mana and is tied together by Rive and spells and using this affix in our helmet. Oh, it's so elegant. It makes me so happy that we found this build and that it's so much fun to play. So if you have any ideas about how to play Rive, which is apparently my new favorite skill, oh my god, I never thought I was going to say that. Let me know. You can let me know in the comment section of this YouTube video here. You can join Discord. You can come watch Twitch live at twitch.tv/PayerThePig, where we stream Last Epoch almost every single day. But yeah, I guess I'm gonna go play more Rive. I hope not. I don't want to be the person who plays Rive. There's enough people like that. We're gonna go play some other kind of sweet build because I'm sure that there's more stuff waiting to be discovered while we wait for multiplayer to release later this year. So like always, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. I'll see you next time.